Welcome to Open Access Week, or the first presentation of Open Access Week. I wanted to first thank the three staff members who put this together and really pushed it to happen. So Reza, Leonard, Ivana, who's not here. Can you just stand a second? We can recognize you. Thanks for putting this together. It's a new cooperative model where we're asking faculty, students, staff to cooperate and bring new initiatives to campus. So we have to do this. We have limited resources and we really appreciate your efforts. I'm going to do what I tell you not to do in presentation class. I'm going to read from this paper. I'd like to introduce Dr. Chad Briggs and his partner in crime, Tracy Walstrom Briggs, to deliver a talk, Open Access Data and Importance for Security and Intelligence Planning. The ability to access open course academic materials is crucial, not only for university-related research and training, but has implications for national security planning. At most, government employees do not have access to library networks. Analysts who are responsible for science and technology-related policies often must rely on secondary and unreliable sources. Using examples from U.S. national security planning for energy and environmental risk, Dr. Chad Briggs and Tracy Walstrom Briggs will discuss the importance of breaking down barriers between scientists and security planners and the consequences of failing to do so. In the issue of time, I'm just going to say you're both super special people, so I won't add all these things. I introduce Dr. Chad Briggs. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a note to my students, I did ask you to prepare 2 questions based on this presentation. What I didn't mention is that the best questions will appear on the exam. So be creative and think about your fellow students and how you can one-up them. Thank you for coming. What I want to do is to give a, not terribly short, but at least brief enough presentation, just to give a background about how the work that we've done was so important in relying upon open source and open access information, and then open that up to some discussion. So the usual division of labor in our marriage and work was that I give the briefing, and then during the question and answer, Tracy gets to just give all the smart answers. So what I'm going to do is just start by discussing why these things are important in the first place. Without turning off the... So just a little bit of background. Tracy and I actually met in an environmental security course when we were both students at Carleton University in Canada. This was more than a few years ago. And we've been working together ever since, both in graduate school and then eventually as colleagues. And much of the focus that we had originally was on some of the same questions that eventually became important for security, which was, namely, first of all, looking at environmental risk assessments. So why is environment even important for security? Some of the traditional views of this was that, and you can still hear shadows of it, that if there's enough environmental scarcity, if there's too much degradation, this can help lead to conflict. So some people are saying the drought in Syria leads to civil war in Syria, and this is what leads to the rise of ISIS and refugees showing up in Serbia and Croatia. We always thought that it was much more complicated than that. And we wanted to sort of drill under the surface and figure out what are the underlying concepts, what are the things that really lead to these complex problems that oftentimes in political science or international relations get ignored because they're so complex. And when I was first a graduate student, I wrote a paper which was heavily criticizing the international relations community for being overly simplified, for not talking enough to their colleagues across the aisle, and not discussing these complex issues with scientists, with people in other disciplines, people who work in the field, and instead of just relying upon their own internal models, which, and all of you in IR class have already heard me complain about how simplified Americans would often make things look. So what we wanted to do was to expand that and say, well, how do you talk to people in other disciplines? Because it's not easy necessarily. We all have different rules of evidence, we all have different vocabularies, we have different languages in how we describe our work. So that was a huge challenge for us. But it was also the reason why Tracy being a geographer and me being a quasi-geographer, who's one that pretends to be a geographer, we felt comfortable looking at all sorts of different methodologies in different fields and trying to bring them together. My focus in my dissertation was very much on uncertainty, scientific use of data and the importance of uncertainty. And then Tracy, who was also looking at environmental risk issues, at the same time was looking a little bit more on the side of public engagement. So what does it take to engage the public? What does public participation mean? How do you get the general public to in a very meaningful way, engage in the process and share information so that it's not just technical experts sitting in a room somewhere with no contact with anyone, making decisions that ultimately affect all this. So that was the first bit of our career. And then things changed. And they changed because increasingly in the national security field, there was recognition that these issues really mattered. And even though they'd been academic issues since the early 1990s, about 2008, we realized this is the years after Hurricane Katrina in the US. This is when Al Gore had his documentary come out. This is when there was a lot of new scientific data showing just how bad climate change was likely going to be. But no one really knew what it meant. You know, you could say that, okay, there'll be 2 degrees change in temperature on the Celsius scale in the next however many years. What does that mean? You know, because it doesn't sound like much. It doesn't sound like it's that important. Or it sounds like just one of these mild changes and, you know, we can all live with that. So the security community then came to me and started asking, okay, how do we do this? How do we take scientific information and then translate it into something which is usable for policymakers? Because if you just throw information at people, they won't know what to do with it. They might be too vulnerable to special interests, the sort of people who don't want to see anything change. People who say that, oh, it's just 1 or 2 degrees, don't worry about it, right? Because you can't even get that accurate in their home thermostat. People who would say that, well, it might just be natural variation, that it's not really that important. And a lot of the problem was that we kept looking at things as if they were linear, as if, okay, this will just be a gradual change, without really looking at the specificity, meaning looking at what does 2 degrees change mean for, say, agriculture in Kosovo? What does a 2-degree average change mean to sea ice in the Arctic? And what are the impacts of that? What does that change for food security in Kosovo? What does that change for transport routes or for the ecosystem in places in the Arctic? So I started working in 2008 with the US Department of Energy, leading their abrupt climate change and security project. And the purpose of this team was to try and find as many experts around the world who were willing to work on these issues. People who were specialists in climate change, oceanography, glaciology, biology, all sorts of different things. Bring them together in a network, an open source network where we could collaborate, where we could share information. And then ultimately come up with frameworks where we could take that information, translate it into future scenarios that we could use for policymakers and military planners to help plan for this is the future you might have. We won't know exactly what it's going to look like, but we can have some pretty good ideas of what problems we might encounter in the future. So that was from 2008 to 2010, and then from 2010 to 2012, Tracy and I both worked with the US Air Force leading their Minerva program. And this was a program that the Secretary of Defense had set up to bring in some outside experts into the military, give them some authority within what they called Air University, which is the collection of colleges that taught all of the Air Force officers, and essentially shake things up a little bit. The US Navy already had programs in their oceanography program to try and deal with things like climate change. The Air Force didn't really have this. And so our job was to make it real for the Air Force officers, to say, okay, this is why you need to worry about this. This is why climate changes or energy changes or some combination of that. This is why it's going to affect your strategy, why it's going to affect your operations, and why ultimately you're going to need to plan for this ahead of time. Oh, So this goes beyond the standard peer-reviewed information. The standard model for how people deal with scientific information is they'll go onto a library database, they'll search for what's available with keywords, find out what journal articles have been published, and then take information from that. In climate data, it's even one step beyond that. They'll take all the peer-reviewed information, and then as part of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, then they will come up with a compilation of all the peer-reviewed literature and try and come up with a summary which is politically acceptable to all the countries that are involved, which then gives generalized predictions on what the future might look like. Now the problem is this ends up washing out all of the interesting information. It washes out all of the variability in the systems. It tends to go towards the lowest common denominator of what's considered acceptable for prediction. And it doesn't give any sort of granularity, meaning it doesn't answer the questions about what do these changes mean for food production in Kosovo? What does that mean for the security of the country? So that was our job. Our job was to figure out how do you take all of this information and then scale it down to something which is meaningful. But again, we couldn't do this on our own. We couldn't sit in an office in Washington, D.C. or in Ottawa and come up with all of this information. There were no models that existed that could do this predictably. So what we had to do was reach out to the experts, talk to the people who actually work on this day to day, and then understand with them that the most important information is the stuff they hadn't published yet. See, what happens with academic publishing is that you're set with strict methodologies that you have to have 95% certainty before you can get to publish scientific information. The problem is that there's a lot of really interesting information below that 95% certainty. And that the most interesting things that could happen with issues like climate change, no one's certain about until it happens. And by then, it's too late. By then, you've already lost your opportunity to do anything meaningful in advance. So why are we even discussing it then? So what we had to do was get out beyond or ahead of the curve, engage the scientists early, and then figure out, who are the stakeholders, who are the experts, and get, for example, in the case of Kosovo, you would get the Kosovan farmers sitting down at the table with the climate scientists, with the security planners, with the government ministers, and then all together coming up with future scenarios that would describe, okay, here's what the scientific information says, and if this changes, what does that to you, the farmer, mean in terms of your ability to grow crops? What would be the response of the government minister? What would be the responsibility of international organizations, so on and so forth. So you've all seen graphs like this. And this is how we're trained to think. We're trained to think in sort of linear lines. We're trained to think that the future starts here, and then we just extrapolate it into the future. That's not really how things work, however. The reality of climate change, we get more and more uncertainty as we get farther from the present year. But when it gets translated into policy, everyone still focuses on a single point. And they'll say, this is what we're going to see for temperature changes in the future. And by the way, they're only looking usually or discussing temperature changes, air temperature changes. They forget changes in precipitation. They'll often forget to discuss changes in water temperature. They'll forget to discuss changes in ecosystems. So if we're only looking at one measure, and instead of looking at the variability that, well, it may be down here, but it may get this bad right here, over 5 degrees. And we only look at the averages rather than what the variability could be in local communities, then we don't get a very good idea of how severe the problem actually is. It's sort of like saying that of the people in this room, maybe 1 or 2 of you will get sick, violently sick, and possibly die from an illness. But really, that's a low percentage. So on average, you're okay. The problem is we don't deal well with those sorts of percentages if there are catastrophic consequences. So if you average out the impacts, it doesn't look as bad. But if you understand that some of the impacts are going to be so bad that they're unacceptable, then we have to approach this from a very different point of view. Oh, and I need to point out very quickly just a bit of distinction in terms of the difference between open access and open source. Oftentimes, we talk about open source information or open access. They're very different things. Open source information refers to information that's just available out there. in the public sphere. It's the sort of thing that you going out to a cafe or going to some sort of political rally or political hearing or speaking with scientists, it's the sort of information that you can gain yourself. Open access is different. That refers to information that usually has already been collected, has already been analyzed, and it's a question then of whether you have access to it. And one of the big challenges is that oftentimes we don't have access to it. If these are scientific papers, they'll exist behind library paywalls. If they exist within government agencies, then oftentimes they'll exist behind secrecy and classification rules. And that means then that a lot of the information, which originally was open source, doesn't remain open access. There was a story about a colleague of mine who was working for one of the intelligence agencies in the US. If you've ever seen the TV show The Americans, you may have noticed that there's like a special room that they have to go into if they discuss classified information. And in the office where they were sitting, they didn't have one of those rooms. The one intelligence officer had just been to a conference on open source information, so how intelligence agencies can use information that's available just open without having to use clandestine methods. And the other officer was asking her, well, so how was the conference? How did the discussion go about using unclassified information? And she looked around and said, well, you don't have a secure room here, do you? Oh, so I can't discuss it. Because the conference about unclassified information was classified. And that's how government often works, is that intelligence agencies in the US will take all of this information, whether it comes from academics or whether it comes from newspapers or other sources, they'll suck it into this giant black hole in places like Langley or Fort Meade, Maryland, and then it disappears, and no one ever sees it again. It gets covered up in these sort of layers of secrecy, even though they originally came from open sources. Now, admittedly, there are times when that's necessary. I've had students, for example, who've been doing environmental security assessments and realized that if, in the case of one student, she was going to look at a vulnerability analysis of tribes in Darfur. And essentially, it would read as a blueprint for, if I wanted to destroy this society, here's the key area that we would need to target. And she realized, this is actually kind of sensitive information. That even if it comes from open source, once you put all the pieces together, we're not sure we want this out there. So there are considerations, but the standard model is simply to vacuum up everything possible and then never let it see the light of day again. So just briefly to go over our work, and we'll be willing to discuss this in more detail. But the work that happened at the Air Force was essentially asking these questions about how do you develop these new tools and methodologies for translating what are complex combinations of energy security, environmental security. It would be, for example, of asking if Shell is going to be drilling in the Arctic, what is the combination of factors between them drilling in the Arctic, possible consequences of oil spills in the Arctic, changes in the Arctic sea ice, changes in the permafrost near the port facilities where there would be building pipelines, and putting all of those together to come up with some sort of understanding for what that future would look like, and what the security impacts might be, and where the vulnerable points in the system might be. So it was some of the most challenging work I've ever done in my life, but again, it relied upon having open access to information. That if we couldn't talk to the scientists, and for this it's worth mentioning that the Canadian government yesterday, Canada in general, had an election and government has changed. There's a new prime minister in Canada. And one of the criticisms of the former prime minister was that he had very strict regulations on scientists. Government scientists were not allowed to talk to the media without approval of their ministry. They would have to have a political minder with them. Many scientific libraries were shut down, and military officers were not allowed to discuss certain energy or environment-related issues. That really affected our work. It affected our ability to work with the Canadians on these issues. Because even though there was open source information, and it should have been open access, because of certain government regulations, it was being kept from us. And that hurt our ability to carry out assessments and to determine, okay, how badly is climate change going to affect Canada? Of course, that was maybe precisely the point of why the regulations were there in the first place. And ultimately, we had to ask the question, what are we not looking at that might hurt us? We so often focus on what we know and what we're sure we know that we forget to look off to the sides. We forget to look at the little things that we think that's not really important, or actually we don't know very much about it, so it couldn't be that important.
The known unknowns?
Yes. I'm sorry, I always hate it when someone quotes Rumsfeld in front of me, because he wasn't the first guy to say that. But yes, Donald Rumsfeld's famous known knowns, and we were worried about the unknown unknowns. So it was trying to determine what are those things that we're not looking at that we need to look at more often. And again, this came back to my original research about the value of uncertainty. That some of the most important reports that we could write for intelligence agencies were not, this is what we're looking at, and this is how it's going to hurt us. Rather, it was, this is what we're not looking at, this is what no one's looking at, this is why no one's looking at it, and here are possible consequences from no one looking at it. That was vital information for them. That was what they most wanted to know. You will not be asked questions about this slide. Eventually, the methodologies became very complicated. One approach that we had, and one that we're still trying to develop with geophysicists, tsunami experts, and other friends of ours, and some of this came from a quantum physicist who was working with the Swedish military, Henrik Carlson, is to look at sort of the boundaries. If you think visually in terms of the problems that we tend to focus on, and this is what intelligence agencies in the US often view as sort of the Pearl Harbor issue, that if you're focused so much on one thing and you expect only one thing to happen, US forces expected that the Japanese might attack, but they would attack the Philippines. They forgot to look at all the early warning signals of what was happening around Hawaii. So if you look just here, and you'll tend to look at what we call the Horizon 1 issues, the immediate impacts of the thing we are looking most closely at. But we'll tend to forget that there are cascading impacts. That if there's a drought, this is going to affect food production. But what does the lack of food production mean for migrant flows? And what do migrants showing up in other countries mean then for the security or the politics of that country? And ultimately, the security issues that we are most interested in are these Horizon 3 issues, the ones that exist on the outskirts, that we're not looking directly at. And likewise, when we think of these starting conditions, we're not thinking of just one thing. We're not thinking of just what if there's a drought. We think of combinations of factors. So you combine different things at the same time. What if there's a drought at the same time that there's a tropical storm in the Mediterranean, at the same time that there's a nuclear accident in Ukraine, at the same time that, and so on and so forth. And you put these together in a matrix of some sort, and then find out what are the extreme edges of those combinations. Because think of something like Hurricane Sandy. Hurricane Sandy was not just a tropical storm. It was a combination of factors. It was a tropical storm that then turned west into New York. It met an Arctic front. It happened at high tide on a full moon. And the bit of scenario that no one would have ever believed if we'd said this, it happened a week before a presidential election. All those factors came together to make it as powerful a storm as it actually was. Any single thing, any single factor in that storm would have been easily either a non-factor or people can handle it on its own. It was when they came in combination. So that was what we tried to look at, what we still work on, or what are the improbable combinations of probable factors. The things that, when they all come together, you get this sort of perfect storm of bad situations that then overwhelm the vulnerability of the system. So I won't go into detail about the Hawaii example right now, but it's something I can talk about. It was one of the examples we had of bringing together experts from the US military, from universities, from local experts, people who worked in the city, diplomats, and getting them all to develop scenarios of what it might look like given certain geophysical changes in the Pacific. If you only have small changes of even 1 degree Celsius in sea surface temperature in the Pacific, you can have huge changes in what happens to the Hawaiian Islands. And we're seeing that more and more in recent years, ever since we developed those scenarios. That they're seeing things they never prepared for because they were looking at the historical record. Because they were looking at, well, this hasn't happened for 20 years, so why should we worry about it now? And now it's happening several times each year. And on these islands, there are certain vulnerable points that were never prepared for that sort of combination of storms. Things like these port facilities, things like the airports, all of the imports that come into the island, that once they're overwhelmed, you're going to have 1 million people that are essentially stranded. So what we do is develop these sort of scenario planning methodologies that we look for these improbable combinations, that we get people to sort of think outside of the box, to work together. And this is an example of some of the people we worked with at the International Polar Year in Montreal several years ago. And for them then to share information, to help translate the risks, and to say, if this is our mission, if this is what we're trying to accomplish, what are the factors that might interfere with our ability to carry out that mission or that strategy? And ultimately, this is what, in intelligence terms, is known as a net assessment. And a net assessment, this was used during the Cold War by the Pentagon to assess US preparedness against the Soviets. And what they would ask is not, what are the Soviets most likely to do? Rather, they would ask, what are the Soviets capable of doing? And what is the worst sort of combination of events, and are we prepared to deal with it? So what we did was to simply ask this in terms of energy and environment terms. What is the combination of events? What are the capabilities that we possess to respond to those events? And what are the vulnerabilities within the system? Because if we can identify those in advance, we can start to work to increase the resilience of the system, to use the information from all the experts and the scientists that we're working with to make sure those vulnerabilities aren't quite as bad. To make sure that those, what in military called critical nodes, aren't going to be overwhelmed. So that you don't have, for example, a tsunami that hits the Japanese coast, and then when it hits a nuclear power plant, remember the Fukushima disaster happened not because it overwhelmed the reactor. What happened is that under normal circumstance with an earthquake, the outside power was shut off, the reactors shut themselves off, the cooling system still needed to be cooled to water. So for that they used a backup diesel generator. The problem was someone put the backup diesel generator right behind the seawall, rather than putting it up on the hill. And the tsunami knocked out that generator, and it set off a series of events, which eventually led to a nuclear meltdown and really catastrophic consequences, not just for Japan, but geopolitically that had impacts on the nuclear industry really across the globe. So if we can ask those questions in advance, if sometimes the information is out there, it is already open access, but we haven't translated it. And that's the second point of open access, is that even if you have access to it, you're still going to need access to the experts to help you translate the information, to help shepherd it and make it something usable. So we look for early warning signals. This is a photo of the sinkholes that have started appearing in Siberia. They're just giant, this would be about 100 meters across, holes that appear just out of nowhere. And they appear in satellite photos, and then the US and other allies will ask, hey, can we send some guys in to go look at this? And some scientists describe this is an early warning. This is an indication that the permafrost in the Arctic tundra is melting. And this might mean something for the future. This might mean, what do we have to worry about for future greenhouse gas releases? What does this mean for stability of Arctic settlements? But we ourselves can't translate that, right? So if we get certain scientists who can say, hey, look, here's a potential problem, then we have to get groups together to say, what does this mean? And what does this mean for the future? Because a hole like this by itself, unless it happens over a settlement or under a settlement, isn't a problem yet. But what we want to know is, when does it become a problem? And how do we understand this information? But ultimately, there are going to be problems associated with this and barriers. And I just want to mention these because the first one, in terms of government secrecy, I've already mentioned. Governments love to not share information. Even the United States, which has a long tradition and has a lot of laws in place to provide free information, is also the biggest collector of classified information in the world. Governments don't like to share necessarily. It can be politically inconvenient for them. And many European countries, for example, don't share their census data with the public. You actually have to pay for that data. And that can really affect the ability of people to carry out assessments in a very meaningful way. So open access needs to be applied not just to universities, but very much to governments. And I understand in certain cases that can be difficult, but there are a lot of cases in which it's absolutely essential. But then at universities as well, academic publishing tends to reward people for publishing in certain journals. And those certain journals, the best known ones, are also the ones that are going to cost someone between $20 to $100 per article to look at. And so it's only people, say, an institution like this that has access to very good quality databases and expensive databases that they can even see this information. But for others, it means that, including government analysts, they simply have no access to it. And for example, when I was working for the Air Force, oftentimes we would have to go directly to the scientists and ask them, excuse me, can I have a copy of your paper? Because we didn't have any library that we could go to. And once you've lost that access to a library, you really feel it. And there's no reward. For most university faculty, most university professors, there's no reward for going out and sharing information, for saying, oh, here's what we don't know and here's why we don't know it. And here's the stuff that keeps me up at night, but that I can't publish yet because I don't have concrete information. No one gets rewarded for doing that. Professors get rewarded for publishing things in certain journals and according to certain criteria. And we generally had to recruit people to help work with us simply because they were so interested, they were so worried that they would volunteer their time. But that's not really a sustainable model. And so it means that even though there is open source information there, and it is technically open access doesn't mean that you necessarily get that information for free. Because the scientists, the people who work on these issues, the ones that hold that information, and you have to give them some incentive to share it, because it takes their time, their involvement, and it's not a simple process. And finally, there's politics of denial. Like I said, a lot of governments don't want to share information because they don't want the information to be out there. But they prefer that if no one knows about a problem, it doesn't exist. And it's the ostrich sticking its head in the sand. And that's also something that has to be overcome. It's far too easy for people to simply ignore information, to ignore data, and then once the problem comes up related to it, to throw up their hands and say, well, we didn't know, this was a black swan event, no one warned us, so how could we possibly be responsible for it? But these things are too catastrophic to be left up to political games. A lot of the scenarios that we've developed are really scary, and a lot of them have already started coming true. So what we need to do is really to get governments and universities to cooperate more, to understand that collectively we're all in this together, and that unless we can share that information, unless we can provide forums that can help translate that information and make it meaningful to policymakers, then we're going to have to live with the catastrophic consequences of things that we would otherwise like to pretend don't exist. All right, I'm going to keep the formal comments to there, but what I would ask you is, please ask us questions. Tracy, please. Where's the other mic?
One of the things that I didn't want you to maybe go into a bit more detail is that sometimes when it comes to governments hiding information, it's not always done in a direct way, meaning they are simply banning information. There are different ways for obscuring what they don't want seen, and I think maybe you could discuss your PhD work and the different ways that different governments responded to hiding information.
Okay. It's something I mentioned, I think sometimes in my policy class, that governments have different ways of dealing with information. And it depends upon the legal structures, it depends upon the sort of political culture, it depends upon the responsiveness of institutions like the courts. But I told this story before about under communist governments, what would typically happen is that the party would turn to the scientists and say, we're really in support of this project, so come up with your scientific study, but just make sure you have this conclusion at the end. And it was very much a deliberate, reshaping of information and political control. With other countries, they would simply say that, all right, do whatever studies you want, the scientists, just don't do it within this geographic area, because that might be inconvenient for us. And that was the case in places like Norway. Or what I found in the United States was that because the United States was legally obligated to share information about environmental consequences and risks, what they would do is publish absolutely everything and flood people with information so that it was only a poor PhD student like myself who had 2 years to sift through all the documents who could find the key pieces of information about how data might have been manipulated and how they were hiding the impacts, potential impacts from this particular project. So each country has its own approach to things. And it depends upon levels of corruption in the government, depends upon levels of political control. And what's interesting is that even in highly repressive governments, there's a really interesting book by Douglas Reiner called A Little Corner of Freedom. That was a history of ecologists in the Soviet Union. And it talked about how they kept their own little community and how they could sort of, under all of these other pressures of political control and Lysenkoism in the Soviet Union, that they still sort of managed to maintain their identity as ecologists and scientists. And that ultimately that was important for when the Soviet Union collapsed and this very nascent environment movement came about. Yes, Mark.
Chair, let me just ask about two institutions quickly. I recall being at a World Bank conference on something else, but in 2005. I wanted to ask about two institutions which might be doing this kind of work outside of DoD. And one is the UN. I mean, the UN was financing all of this really good research. I heard these presentations made in 2005 about climate change that was just really impressive. And it was made at a forum of parliamentarians all over the world, so that they were there, listening to this. So that's one. I'm just curious as to what extent is there any cooperation with them. And the other would be the NIC, that is National Intelligence Council, the U.S. government, which is sort of the public arm of the CIA. And I know that they had these programs going forward that were looking at, the sort of 15 years ago, the 2020 project, looking what the world would look like in 2020 in all these areas. And I'm just wondering if, and some of the papers I read on the website was really interesting about, just the kind of thinking outside the box conceptually, not necessarily about environment. I'm just wondering how that plays into the kind of stuff you're doing.
Well, I guess with reference to whether or not the DoD is working with, say, the UN, one thing we did find was that there was kind of a real barrier, reluctance to cooperate between these kind of, not just the organizations themselves, but I think the military, the U.S. military was very reluctant to get involved in humanitarian efforts in general. And so I think that probably could explain why there doesn't seem to be that much kind of cross working together, even though we see the U.S. Military being drawn ever more into having to respond to natural disasters around the world. We're still, even though there's a reluctance for the humanitarian groups to be acknowledged as cooperating too closely with the U.S. military, or any military in fact, because they want to be seen as kind of above the fray. And you have the U.S. military kind of being reluctant to be drawn into kind of, I guess,
Nation building.
nation building.
But do they use the information they're generating by these multilateral institutions?
Yeah, they can. I mean, certainly there are a lot of smart people, right? But one problem we often encountered was just the rotation of people throughout different theaters. So typically the US military, you serve in one theater for a certain period of time and then you get moved somewhere else. And so as soon as someone gets knowledge about the Pacific, they get moved back to Europe. And then, they spend time in Africa, and then as soon as they're comfortable in Africa, then they get moved to Asia. That was a constant problem. There was really good work with the UN, with our Swedish friends in the military, on doing things like rapid impact assessments. So asking like, okay, you send peacekeepers into an area, what's their environmental impact? Why is it so important that troops in Afghanistan make sure that they know which animals are endangered or not? Because suddenly new markets will show up, and so you get wildlife that are being threatened because there's a sudden influx of foreign money. Or
well, there is also a beginning of understanding that when you're looking at security issues, you have to think about the human security issues all around you. You have to care about the citizens that are just beyond your base, because that allows you to have greater cooperation and actually see much more progress in terms of security strengthening around you.
yeah, and just to answer your question about the NIC, although this applies to a number of intelligence agencies. Yeah, I had contact with them, although it came really after the Air Force work. And then it just happened that at a meeting in Stockholm, and I'm talking about Hawaii, suddenly everyone from the NIC, including the director, is there. And they were interested, but there's only so much movement they can have. And so, yeah, people like Matt Burrows work on issues like global trends, and they'll look into the future. And not to criticize Matt, I think the work is very valuable, but sometimes it's looking at still predictable directions, right? And so what was really interesting for a lot of people is to find the specific examples. We could point out, look, this port in Oahu is going to get knocked out for this reason and this reason, and this is backed by these scientific studies and these scientific studies. That really caught their attention, because that's very different than just talking about general demographic trends, or here's this part of the world might be more unstable in the future. But ultimately, they come up against all the counterintelligence culture. When we worked with the Department of Energy, there was this serious effort, because it couldn't be housed at CIA, you couldn't do any unclassified work there. And yet, the Department of Energy, which normally people would think they have all the labs, they have all these scientists, but yet, because they're also responsible for keeping nuclear secrets, there was a very strong counterintelligence culture. So there was also a strong emphasis against, like, why are you talking about these foreigners? I said, well, that shouldn't be an issue. They're experts. It doesn't matter whether the guy's Belgian or Australian or American, right? I mean, it's an expert. In the scientific community, you don't talk about borders like that. But that came up against this strong intelligence culture of, why are you sharing information in the first place? And that's a constant problem, because it's a constant justification that had to be made.
Yeah, I can speak louder, I guess. Thanks for everything that you're informing us about. It's actually very, very interesting subject. I had the privilege to work with the Kosovo government in doing the strategic security sector review, and it was the first time that they decided to also review the human security. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so they decided to review human security as well as part of it, which means they involved all the institutions, and we realized that our capabilities were almost zero in responding to emergencies. We were all sleeping through earthquakes and floods and could not respond very well to that. I mean, we do have a limited capability, but we're using our military to do the job of the emergency management agency. Basically, we're nowhere close to where we want to be. And when the risk chart was being constructed, probability consequence chart, we realized we struck this huge problem. Our government is led by politicians who think 4-year terms and voters and translating money into actual results that bring them more votes. When we were doing the risk and consequence chart, we realized that those things, natural disasters especially, they were very low probability, but the consequences were unbearable. I mean, we realized that if a really big earthquake hit us, you know, just kind of doing a tabletop scenario, all the institutions were just, their hands were tied. There was nothing they could do. The capabilities were nowhere to be found. And so my question is, even though we realized that was the depressing part was actually realizing how bad it could get, how to bring these subjects up the list, because when we actually decided to address all the roles and missions of institutions, at the top of the scenario list were those that were high probability, but usually the consequences were very low. The low probability, high consequence risks made it at the end of the scenarios, which means they get less attention, less money, and so forth and so on. And regardless of the recommendations of the Strategic Security Sector Review, the government is doing absolutely nothing to actually implement those recommendations. So my question to you is, in your experience, how do you pursue governments to give it more attention / money / more activity to these subjects, which obviously could affect the society at large, but don't directly translate to them in what they're interested in. And as decision makers, of course, they can focus on one thing or the other.
One thing is that we dropped discussion of probabilities, which seemed sort of heretical for risk assessment to not discuss probabilities. But we found out that people were so focused on it that as you described, if people thought it was low probability, even if it had this long tail of catastrophic consequences, well, let's just not worry about it because it's low probability. And what we found was that actually that was untrue, that either they weren't low probability, that maybe this was based on certain assumptions that might not have held true in all circumstances, or as I said, if you look at them in combination, then suddenly the probability function just becomes unworkable. So if we were looking at, for example, and this was something we learned in flight school, is that you never worry about the giant catastrophic event, the single catastrophic event. It's always a series of small events that build up into something catastrophic, and you have to stay on top of these because, and if you look at any one of them individually, okay, here's probability and there's an uncertainty associated with it, and then you have a string of 10 of them, suddenly the uncertainty is so big that people think, oh, well, that uncertainty translates to low probability. But that's a misunderstanding of the issue, right? So that we had to get across to policymakers first, was that, okay, just because there's high uncertainty, that doesn't mean low probability. And then what we had to do was in developing scenarios, and this is what Tracy and I spend a lot of our time doing, we had to find the sort of sweet spot of what really does catch their attention. So just to give an example, we were tasked with coming up with a strategic energy and environmental security assessment for the Asia Pacific. All of Asia, the whole hemisphere. And assigned to us were several retired Air Force officers who would essentially act as a red team for us. And so every time we would come up with, hey, let's talk about Bangladesh, and then Tracy and I would work on, hey, this is why Bangladesh is a really important issue. And then Colonel Reed would come back and go, guys, that's not going to work. Because once you start telling that story to the people at top, they're not going to listen to it. So it was this constant dialogue of someone criticizing us before we went to the policymakers or to the generals, of them saying, okay, let's find what really catches their interest. What's the narrative you could say that will make them sit up and go, oh, wait a second, actually, I really care about that. And so what we had to do was, yeah, these generals, they were kind of busy guys, right? So, and we couldn't come in and say, oh yeah, energy and environment is so important. Because they had everything else they were doing. They're dealing with Iraq and Afghanistan and terrorism and all of their usual duties. So what we had to do was to come up with, all right, here's where this issue, which maybe is a higher probability, or is more plausible for them. That was what we focused on, was plausibility. This is where this is going to really screw up your day. And it's going to screw up your operations, it's going to screw up your strategy, it's going to screw up your ability to carry out what you already want to do day to day. And the volcanic ash cloud is an example of that, when we first tried. I don't know if you want to mention that just for a second. So one of the first times we tried this was the Air Force have war games, and for the senior officers, it's a strategic war game where they're given 3 huge problems to deal with. And so it was collapse of government in Mexico, Chinese invasion of this South China Sea, and was it Iranian nuclear weapons? And then the 4th one was this volcanic eruption in Alaska. And all the officers just sort of laughed and said, oh, volcanic eruption. Yeah, that goes down on our list, right? Because that's not on our list of what we want to worry about.
I guess something also that's interesting to note is this was the first time that in a war game, an environmental layer was actually included in their narrative. And so that was something that we kind of felt quite, I guess, proud about including, because they weren't used to not considering the environment a single flat kind of known entity.
But we had to be very careful about it. So we worked with NASA scientists in identifying, okay, what's the thing that could happen that will look innocuous, but then once they go through the exercises, they'll suddenly realize that this screws up all of their assumptions about navigation and about movement of forces from North America to Asia. So the pilots afterwards were going, wow, that was actually really serious. You know, and we approached it and just sort of brushed it off and said, oh yeah, it's a volcano, you know, we'll fly around it. And then to realize that the consequences of that were so much more than what we thought, because they were forced to deal with that at the same time that they were dealing with their usual day-to-day kind of warfighting duties. And so that was one approach that we used. It's different for military officers than for politicians and policymakers, but what we ultimately found, and I can talk to you more about the Hawaii example, because that was what really got the interest of, say, the National Intelligence Council or the National Security Council of the White House, was to take something that was completely plausible, that didn't say that this is improbable, and it affected something they knew, that they could imagine, and that had some analogs to something that had already happened. Or no, actually, the scenario was created before Hurricane Sandy. Oh, okay. Well, it became relevant very quickly after we wrote it, so I suppose that's why. So if you can be prescient and then like come up with the example before the analogy happens, that would be really great.
Thank you.
I have a quick question. In open access, some of the strategies that have been used have been the WikiLeaks strategy of finding information or data, or even extracting it from databases and posting it somewhere in the world where information will be available on the internet for some time, and then people get access to that information, download it. Of course, there's a problem with verifying validity of that information and seeing if that could be used in any kind of research. But in your work, are these kind of activities happening? And with the community of scientists that you work with, are there known places where you could look for leaks of information that could lead you to other kinds of data or any kind of discussions that's relevant?
The military was really nervous about WikiLeaks, and so by extension we had to be as well. We couldn't use any of the information that came out of WikiLeaks. I had to be even careful not to look it up on my computer because I didn't want it traced back to us. And although there were 1 or 2 pieces of information that I stumbled across as sort of, you know, it had been already filtered through another news organization or something, for example, about, you know, U.S. Embassy in China worried about the stability of construction of Chinese dams, you know, that sort of thing, or the power plants. It's the verification of information that's really difficult, and that's why there's still value to be had with the academic journals. It would just be nice if the economic model, or the business model of the academic journals was different. The US military actually has a very good model for open access journals. All of their journals, so like Parameters or PRISM or you know, Joint Forces Quarterly, they're all open access. And that was one of the first times where I published in something that, you know, the editors were really helpful, and you know, they'd go out and find maps for us and do all the, even the little editing that normally professors have to do themselves. And then it was completely free to anyone to see. And it was kind of ironic in a way that, you know, it was the military that was doing that. But that was really valuable. But in terms of the leaking information, that, I don't know, because that's where you get the culture clash of the sort of people who are paranoid about losing secrets versus the people who are desperate to find more information. But our ability to vet that information, to know whether it was legitimate or not, that was really tough. And so that's, and that was also the importance, however, of the human networks. Because if something just exists out on a computer network somewhere, who knows who put it up there, right? And you can always plant false information. And we ultimately wanted to have human contact with most of the people we worked with, because it was still so important. And so we still, in our work, try to do face-to-face work as much as possible, because that's the best sort of open access. Is, okay, we found this information, but then I want to ask you, is this true? Is there any basis behind this? And then usually there's a long explanation about, well, yes, but no, and under these circumstances. So we always needed that translation for us.
Okay. Hi, my name is Bert. My name is Merton. I'm open data advocate from engaging some activities of procurement data of open data Kosovo. What I want to know through your experiences, there are still missing data of Kosovo's in this organization because they've been visualizing data of different services, different data of the countries, but there are still missing military data. I want to know more why this is happening. Don't you think that through your experiences, there is no transparency in the military governance? There is always, we should know where the money goes, why we're spending money on the military. But there is no transparency of the military governance always. We're still missing data of the military. Why do you think that? Do you think that open data of the military spending would always raise the country's sovereignty? Thank you.
There are always secret budgets. I think even in Canada there was a secret budget for buying new weapons like the F-35. And that's a cultural issue, because you can have open information, but that's different from open government. And when you can overlap them, that's transparency in government. But a lot of people don't, they're afraid of that sort of transparency, because then that means accountability for them. And that's precisely why in scientific publishing, there has to be some sort of transparency, because then you have to be able to trace the data back to where it originally came from. That culture doesn't exist in many, perhaps even most governments. And it's, you don't want the public getting involved too much. And even with local environmental issues, I mean, you dealt with this, right? Where it was easier for decide, announce, defend policies where, let's be transparent by telling you what you need to know. And that's about it. But no meaningful interaction, right? We'll all do this pro forma so that it looks like we're legitimate, but in reality, that's not true.
What I'm wondering is, to what extent maybe some of the secrecy in the budgets, would this have to do with maybe access, or where the funding might be coming from as well? Because I mean, you have a lot of international organizations and military involved in Kosovo, correct? So is that something that maybe would have an influence on keeping some secrecy over the budget?
Maybe, but I don't think so.
No?
Just they're hesitating to give data. I don't know the reason why. That's why I'm asking. Are all world countries not transparent in the military governance and the military data, or only some specific countries because of their secrecy?
And it is true that, and not an example that necessarily you're talking about, because if people are spending money in the military, someone knows at least where some of the money's going. But in a lot of cases, I started working in the Balkans and in Bosnia, where there simply was no data, on a lot of issues, like environmental issues. No one knew anything. And so you have to use these sort of proxy measures of saying, well, if you want to know where environmental issues are, I found out I had to go talk to medical students. Because they had some idea and they were interested, and then they'd tell me, okay, well, you go to Zenica, go to Zenica, look at the air, look at the water. And so we had to use these sort of epidemiological methods of how do you start an assessment when you have no information at all. And you have to use these sort of weak signals to say, okay, maybe we need to start focusing here, and then if you get enough initial information, then we know that we need to invest and start focusing more. So that's a big challenge in parts of the world like the Balkans, where oftentimes you can complain about access to information, but sometimes it's not even there in the first place. And that's a huge challenge for policy. Yes?
In relation to one of the questions mentioned before, is the point of focus of yours to solve the problems? For example, after analyzing and combining all the factors, and if you, for example, find that there's a low probability of happening something with really bad consequences, but there is a low ability of solving that too, what would you do? And also, you mentioned that besides having open sources, you should have also experts and analysts. Do you tend to get also the authors of the books that they are published and get that hidden information? And if that unpublished information is very important, are you working in and hiding that by, for example, classifying? You could do, for example, publishing scientific books with 95% or more certainty in another class, and also those that have low than 95% of certainty in another one. So you could have more open information in this case.
One challenge is that it's really hard to publish some of the information that we come up with because it doesn't fit the academic rules. So we have all sorts of interesting information, but it doesn't fit very neatly into the academic or scientific journals. I'm dealing with that right now because we had some discussions about how what happened in Fukushima ultimately affected politics in Germany, which affected what happened in Ukraine. And I don't know how to fit what the editors and the reviewers want to get that information out there. So we can publish it ourselves and get it out electronically, but that's very different. And it doesn't have the same impact then, for people to look at it. But it's been very important, to get those authors at the table as much as possible.
And that was one of the keys. It's not so much solving these problems, because there's no such thing really, because I guess it's more about bringing together different people, different experts who would never normally be in the same room together. So that actually enables these people to start developing networks of their own to figure out, well, if this type of thing happens, I have other people to talk to other than just the people in my office who may not necessarily be able to help me when things go bad. So that was also one of the key elements we found, is that you need to get people out of their silos, out of their kind of comfort zones, and have them really beginning to look at problems in ways they never could have imagined. And that in itself helps training the people who will be forced to respond when something, some type of disaster happens, for instance.
And this is standard military training. So oftentimes officers will be faced with, okay, here's the situation that maybe it's improbable, but it's possible. So we're going to have to train for this, because otherwise you'll be completely unprepared. You won't know how to react to the situation. And the same thing happened in flight training. Most of what pilots are trained to do is never actually going to happen in their day-to-day work. If they're pilots, and yet it's absolutely vital that they know what those situations might be and how to react to them. So, yeah, we don't take it on ourselves to solve everything, because it's crazy. Our work is stressful enough as it is.
It's not possible. That's
No, and there's also an interesting political role. I mean, the role of, say, the intelligence agencies is to provide warning, right? But then it's up to someone else to provide the solution. Because then that becomes a political question. Is it worth investing in? Is this something worth saving? Is this something that we need to deal with, or can we ignore it? So that's the best that we could often do. And it was a useful distinction, is to say, look, we will warn you about what might happen. but and what our capabilities are and what we can do and where the vulnerabilities might lie. But beyond that, we're going to have to pass it off to someone else because that's as much as we can do.
So this is kind of related to what Katrina asked about keeping the information secret. So do the governments do that only because they have uncertainty issues and maybe because they don't know really how to handle it at that moment, or is it also to maintain power in the international system in general?
You know, in some circumstances, it might also be to try and keep people from panicking too much. I mean, when you look at, say, the emergency response teams in New York, there was a lot of information that they've been working on to try and prepare for like a Hurricane Sandy scenario. And one of the things that they needed to do was to be really cautious about what information they put out there. You want to put out enough information that gets people figuring out how to prepare themselves for such events, but you don't want to do it in such a way that they're so panicked that they can't act because they're just too scared. So there's sometimes just a balancing act of how you communicate the information in a way that's going to be actually useful and I guess
Avoid false alarms.
yeah, you want to avoid false alarms. I mean, so that's also one other.
Yeah, with for example, tsunamis in a lot of Pacific island states, including Hawaii, they'll have tsunami drills or they'll have tsunami warnings, and then everyone has to go up to higher ground. And if you have enough of those, people just start to ignore them. And that's really bad, right? So if people get too many early warnings, you know, some people can deal with that. The general public, it's sometimes more difficult because you have this collective action problem. And secrecy in general, that's just the policy. It's simpler to do that. You know, if I'm working in the CIA and I get a document on my desk, it's classified, right? Because I've touched it. And that's really how it works. So in our Air Force work, we deliberately had to say we are not going to get security clearances. Because then otherwise we couldn't work in the open access space with other scientists. Because then they would know that anything we published could be locked away by the military as being classified, simply because we had security classifications and security clearances. So we had to avoid that entirely, and that meant that there was some information maybe we didn't have, but it gave us access to even more information. And this is really counterintuitive for people in government to think that you're avoiding a clearance and that actually gives you access to more information. But that was really how it worked. So.
Last question.
All right. What's your opinion about climate impacts changes in terms of potential policy failure? I mean, what would the consequences be?
What would the consequences be for policy, or how are we failing to address the consequences?
How are we failing to address?
Oh, in every possible way, I think. I'm not very confident about the whole process, you know, the UNFCCC process that takes place, you know, this winter in Paris. With compliments to my friends who dedicate their lives to working on this issue, it's an institution that was built up 20, 30 years ago with a very different understanding of the issue. And what we've found is frankly, it's like Tracy suggested, it's scary information. You know, when I started working on this in DOE in about 2008, 2009, I was flooded with information because suddenly I had access to all these scientists. And I wasn't just looking at the peer-reviewed stuff. I was having them come to me and saying, all right, Chadwick, this is the stuff that really keeps me up at night. And this is the reason why we haven't published it yet. But this is the stuff that you're probably going to see in about another 2 to 3, 4 years come out in the literature. Or here are the things that could happen that we just can't prove yet, but it really looks like it fits. And God, that was scary. I mean, you can ask Tracy. The first 6 months that I worked with that team, I didn't sleep at all. I mean, I was just up, going, oh my God, how do we even deal with this? You know, where do we start? And it represented all these policy failures. The biggest one, though, is not just the failure to share information, but the failure to just come up with, I think, a public imagination of how bad it could be.
Well, and how do you plan for something that's never happened before? If you've got some kind of tipping point that happens, we've never seen the type of problem that arises, how do you get people kind of with that imagination to be able to respond to something they've never seen? So that's
With consequences that are so catastrophic that just give a quick example. When we were living in Pennsylvania, there was a neighbor, older guy, who was arguing against us about climate change. And I'm standing here going, all right, this is my job, fine. And then I noticed that he was looking at his granddaughter when he was saying this. And you understand that psychologically he didn't want to believe how bad it was going to get, because that meant that that was the world his granddaughter was going to grow up in, right? So you can put that information out there, but either it scares people too much or they simply reject it because they can't accept those consequences. And they feel powerless themselves of thinking, well, I'm just this one guy here. What could I possibly do? So you have to package the information in such a way that it's somehow digestible, that it's meaningful for people, but at the same time you give them something meaningful to do to help minimize it or to help make the situation better. And the big policy failure is that they're watering down the impacts. They're making it sound too general, and at the same time they're not really giving us any solutions. That they're not saying that we should do anything other than, oh, maybe we should go plant a few trees, and maybe we should make sure that air in our car tires is filled up enough that we can increase our gas mileage. And that all seems disconnected with how bad the situation might really get. And that's the big policy failure, is the failure to make those connections and to say, here's what really might happen, and here's what we need to do collectively.
Thank you. Stay tuned for more open access events during the week. Thank you so much.